Are you new to international education or a veteran? In either case, we have a fascinating and helpful episode for you looking at the process of searching for and hiring a new head of school / superintendent. So for our newcomers coming from public school districts, I'd like to clarify the role of head of school. It's quite different from what a U.S.-based superintendent might do. International schools in general are early childhood through 12th grade schools with multiple divisions, each headed by a principal. The HOS, short for head of school, is like a CEO managing the leadership team while also partnering with the board of trustees to do things like create budgets, develop long-term plans, and represent the school with parents and local government authorities, among many other tasks. Ideally, a head of school search team, with emphasis there on team, is formed at least a year before the new head starts the position. Schools often hire a recruiting agency to consult with board members, administrators, teachers, other staff members, and parents, while sometimes even gathering insights from students to decide what qualifications are needed for the position. The consultant helps the search team review applicants, narrow the choices down, leading to an on-campus interview of the finalists. It is an understatement to say that hiring a new school superintendent is a big deal. And to help us better understand how the search process runs from start to finish, we reached out to Dr. Brent Mutsch, who specializes in head of school searches in his role with Search Associates. Dr. Mutsch brings a great deal of experience to his position, having served as the superintendent of the International Schools Group, the superintendent of the Saudi Aramco schools in Saudi Arabia, the superintendent of Singapore American School in Singapore, and you guessed it, the superintendent of the American School of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, all over the course of his 23 years in international education. So get ready for a look under the hood of how the search process runs as Dr. Mutsch's deep understanding of international school communities and their cultures comes through. We learned about the big picture, Dr. Mutsch's passion for international education, and his firm belief that international teaching is an opportunity that more educators need to learn about. This episode was recorded on April 1st, 2023, and now we give you Dr. Brent Mutsch.
Hi, Brent. Thank you so much for being here today. It's great to see you.
It's a pleasure.
So our first question is, where in the world are you today?
Well, I am currently talking to you from Florida. Although we consider Colorado to be home, we have spent a little bit of the winter in the Sunshine State.
Hard to blame you. Well, welcome.
Thank you.
We usually start off by asking our guests to tell a brief going global story. Have you got one for us?
You know, what I find myself really thinking about is reflecting not so much on a specific story, but maybe reflecting more holistically about what 23 years in the international school community really meant to both my wife and to me, and thinking about how wonderful it was to work in school communities in which the quality of the young people that you worked with, the amazing partnership with parents, the phenomenal association with dedicated and caring colleagues, how rich of an experience that was. And I think when you get to a point where I am in life and you're reflecting back on so many things over the course of your life, I would offer that when you're in those moments and you're in those wonderful opportunities as an international educator, that you don't take this experience for granted, because it's an amazing both personal and professional experience. And as I reflect back on a 23-year career in the international school community. It was such an amazing and such a wonderful set of experiences. And as I stepped away from that, the direct association with the school community, I miss it. I miss that day-to-day interaction with students and parents and faculty and staff and leadership colleagues. And so I'm just reminded how special that experience is. And I think how unbelievably important it is that you live each day being in the moment and enjoying the experience for what it is.
What a wonderful answer. And I'm really glad to hear you talking about reflecting, because reflecting is such an important process as we go through life and learning and just enjoying things, to think about and appreciate the experiences we've had. And that's really what this podcast is all about. So you nailed it, Brent. Congrats.
All right, Brent, let's jump into our big guiding question, which connects to your work with Search Associates. So the question is, what does the process of a search for a head of school, as led by Search Associates, look like? And we're going to unpack this big question by asking some smaller questions. So, of course, you were a head of a school for many years. What has been your pathway that led you to becoming a senior consultant at Search and specializing in leadership searches?
Well, I think after having spent 23 years in the international school community, and all of those years were in leadership roles, the transition to Search Associates was a pretty natural and logical one for me in 2017 when I returned to the U.S. So much of my work across the international school community was focused around my own personal direct day-to-day responsibilities for leadership, but working with an international school community that really linked me very strongly with the leadership community. And so, when I returned home, so much of the nature of the work that I think any of us, whether it be at Search Associates or at some of the other leading firms that are engaged in international searches, so much of that work is really about your connectivity with people and that constellation of relationships that you have with people. And so it seemed only natural and logical to try to leverage the relationships that had developed over a 23-year period, both within the international school community, but recognizing what were going to be the steps to take to further that scope of relationships. And so joining Search in 2017 and now having been with them for almost 6 years was just a natural and logical thing for me to do. And it also, quite candidly, David, kept me connected with a community that I love and that I enjoy. Right. So it was a wonderful way to make a transition into, quite candidly, another phase of life.
That makes so much sense. I love it. I'm envious because this is how we're keeping our foot in it, but in a different way. But I do miss the traveling around. So I can imagine, as I think about searches for heads, that they take a long time. And I recall in schools where I've been that the exiting head typically needs to give at least a year notice, when possible, before their final contract day. Is that accurate? How does that work?
I think, Audrey, what I would say is in a pre-COVID world, forward-looking heads of schools and boards were looking really even 18 to 24 months out. And ideally, in the years that I was doing this work pre-COVID, we were working with a lot of schools that actually wanted to make an appointment and announce an appointment with a full year in advance of the existing director, head of school, or superintendent actually leaving, so that they had a more than adequate time to really focus on a smooth and successful process of transition. COVID has, as it has everywhere, it turned our world upside down. And I think it significantly disrupted schools' capacity to be looking out that far. And I think we're just now beginning to start to see some degree to a return to that kind of normalcy. We're engaged in a number of searches right now where boards are in fact looking out 18 months. And that's the ideal time frame.
I'm sure there are exceptions to that when extenuating circumstances lead ahead to leave a school. And we did talk about that with Bob Gross in a previous episode. So.
Yeah, absolutely. There are. I mean, transitions occur for as many reasons as you could possibly imagine, and sometimes of deeply personal motivations, and something occurs and someone has to step away. But I think that there are any of a number of organizations within the international school community that are prepared to really partner with schools to assist them in conducting a successful search, even if that search may demand that you actually look for an interim person on relatively short notice. We have a number of people who, quite frankly, are part of our database who, they don't have an interest in making that, longer multi-year commitment. But if there was an opportunity to step in to an international school community for 6 months, for 9 months, for 12 months, they're very interested in doing that. And so I think that any of a number of the organizations are poised to help schools address their leadership needs in whatever time frame may ultimately be dictated by circumstances.
Oh, that's good to hear.
And with the start of baseball in the United States, it sounds like you've got quite a bullpen of your retired heads of school, and that they can step in, like you're saying. We use the word pivot a lot. Just as you've pivoted in your position from being a head of school to working with search, and Audrey and I are pivoting in our own ways, it does make sense that people leaving the international school scene get that itch and they want to go back a little bit, but maybe not on a full tour for several years. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that comes so often also, David, with where someone is in the journey of life. And so, to your point, they don't want to step away completely, but they also don't want to. I mean, when you reflect on this a little bit, most boards that certainly I know that I work with are really looking at wanting to launch a search, looking at a new head of school or director or superintendent who's going to come to the organization for a fairly extended period of time to really provide them with consistency and continuity and leadership. But sometimes when you need maybe someone just to step in, you look for those candidates who that's where they are in their life journey, and they're much more interested in that shorter term commitment.
It's just a total win-win, I think. It's lovely.
Yeah. Well, we're going to try to come at the whole process from a couple different perspectives. So could you take us through the process from start to finish from the perspective of an applicant? An applicant is out there, he or she hears about a school that's opening up this new head of school position, maybe 12 or, like you're saying, 18 months in the future. How does that process run?
So from a candidate's perspective, I mean, to your point, David, the first thing that you do is you become aware of a particular leadership role that is vacant. And I think in a very thoughtful and reflective way, you think about geographically, is that a part of the world in which you'd like to live for a period of time? Is the school that has the vacancy itself a school that you could see yourself being an active member of that community? And then I think as you really start to delve into it more deeply, you want to really look carefully at the nature of the job vacancy announcement, because it generally will speak to where is the school in its current journey, and what does that school community and what does that board specifically see that the school needs at this point in time in its journey. And I think schools need different things at different times. And so when you ask kind of that bigger question, the guiding question, what does that successful search look like? I think in part it's successful when both a combination of the candidate that the board wishes to appoint and the board itself are equally enthusiastic about accepting the position. But you get there through a process and through a journey. And that process, I think, is on the applicant's part, their ability to really reflect on where the school is in its journey and what its needs are, and the degree to which they possess, the knowledge base and the skill set and the understandings that are going to contribute to them being potentially the right fit. And so at that point, you choose to make a formal application for the position. I think in the case of most of us as recruiting consultants and engaged with this recruiting work, we're going to interview each of the candidates who apply for the position to really talk to them about where the school is in its journey and to talk to them about where their strengths have the potential to be a good fit and the right match with the needs of the school at that point in time. And the candidate who really is able to present themselves in a way that reflects to the consultant that, yes, in fact, they do have the potential to be the right fit, will find themselves, after they've submitted an application, not only being interviewed, but also having that consultant reaching out to their confidential references. And when those confidential references further validate that the candidate is, in fact, a strong candidate, then the candidate will find her or his profile advanced to a search committee. Now, it's both my experience and my observation that search committees will then really work through all the material that you put in front of them to give consideration to who they're going to invite into that next round of interviews. And that next round of interviews, that's generally conducted by the search committee itself, will really set the stage for identifying who are their finalists. And in the case of heads of schools, directors, superintendent roles, more often than not, most schools are identifying 3 finalists, and they're looking then to invite those finalists to come to their community. And that visit to the community really has 2 primary purposes. It first and foremost is the opportunity, obviously, for the candidate to present themselves and their candidacy to the community, and to often interact with students, to interact with parents, with faculty and staff, interact with other members of the leadership team, obviously to interact with the board in more formal interviews. But in addition, it's also an opportunity, and we always underscore this with the boards that we work with, this is an important part of the process by way of the candidate really further familiarizing themselves with the school community itself. Because often if you haven't lived somewhere or worked in a particular geographic location, you're constructing an understanding of what it would mean to come to work both with and for that board of directors or board of trustees. And a part of a successful process is really for you to become very familiar, or certainly as familiar as you can become, with that community itself. So we see the on-campus visit interviewing process as really being a very, very important part of the overall process, where not only does the community find themselves learning about, the candidates and the strengths of the candidates and why she or he might be the right fit and the best fit for the leadership role, but we also see equally importantly an opportunity for that candidate to further construct their understanding of the community in which they may, at some point in the very near future, become not only a member of that community and live and reside in that community, but also be actively engaged in leadership.
Yeah, that makes
role.
a lot of sense. We had wondered whether, with the sort of the advent of video conferencing, whether heads were still flown to the location, but it just makes so much sense that there are all those interactions that go on in between interviews where they're meeting people and talking to them and looking around and going out to dinner and such. So it makes sense that schools would still fly in their top candidates. So.
And Audrey, that's an interesting comment. I mean, I think throughout the course of COVID, we all had to, as David said a moment ago, we had to pivot. We had to move to doing so much of our work in a completely different way. And I think, quite candidly, most schools were able to successfully pivot around working to identify the people that they brought to their school, whether it was members of faculty, members of staff, members of their respective leadership team. But I think at Search Associates, what we're beginning to now experience in more of a post-COVID world is that people have really kind of validated, they have affirmed the importance of that face-to-face interaction. And as we return to in-person fairs this spring, we found that those fairs were unbelievably well subscribed. People look forward to coming back together. So I think as powerfully and as effective as the virtual work has been throughout COVID, I think there's still a recognition on everyone's part. I think candidates and school representatives alike that at the end of the day, there's something about that personal face-to-face interaction that continues to be so absolutely critical. So whether it's in the hiring of faculty or certainly whether it's also in the hiring of members of the leadership team, the degree to which you can return to some levels of face-to-face interaction has been really, really important. But that's very much right now been bore out by what I see schools doing in their leadership searches. If at this point they can bring people in, they definitely are doing that. And schools didn't do it only when, quite frankly, the restrictions associated with COVID didn't allow them to do it.
So you've really largely touched on this, but maybe you can dive a little deeper into it. We were curious about how the process from kind of start to finish again looks from the perspective of the school community. So the board, the parents, students, teachers, admin team, and so on.
Yeah, I think that in some ways that dynamic varies a little bit from community to community based on the nature of the operation of the organization itself and the degree to which the board really sees the importance of a community participatory process occurring in the appointment, let's say, of a new head of school or a director or a superintendent. And I think it's our experience that in most schools, they do, in fact, want there to be a relatively high degree of interaction between the candidates and the various constituent groups in the community. And we certainly emphasize it because, as I said just a moment ago, from the candidate perspective, it's an opportunity for that person to really fully or more fully develop their own understanding of the community. And they do that through interaction with students and with parents and faculty and staff and current members of the leadership team as well as the board. And so from a community perspective, we really emphasize the importance of engagement of the various constituent stakeholder groups across the community, and sometimes to act in a little bit of an advisory capacity, to talk with the candidates and to feed that information back to the board, not to say to the board, this is who we think, the first candidate, the second candidate, the third candidate is. Matter of fact, we very strongly discourage the rank ordering of any group that interacts with the candidates, because that can set up, quite candidly, a very polarizing kind of dynamic in the search process. But I think we do see multiple perspectives and the sharing of those perspectives with the board prior to their deliberation and making a decision as just a further opportunity for the board to get input and to hear from a variety of different groups in their community and to weigh that input as a part of their overall decision making. And so I think, it is at the end of the day always a decision that ultimately rests with the board or with the ownership group. But I think to the extent that there's opportunities for a significant amount of input prior to their making that decision, we see that as so often contributing to a value-added component of the search process, having the opportunity to be successful.
It makes sense that you're getting kind of more bang for your buck. If you're flying them in, they might as well meet with as many people as you can as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I'm hearing of that advisor role for both sides of this process. And I can picture the school that's maybe had a long-term head of school. He or she's retiring, I don't know, after a decade, and they don't know where to start, right? And they really need your coming in and pulling out that guidebook and doing some hand-holding and helping them through the process. So I'm sure that's a big part of what you're doing as well.
I think it is, David. There's no doubt that so often boards, which so often consist, quite frankly, of really dedicated volunteers, it often is a situation where we're working with a board that maybe has had very, very little opportunity to be engaged in the process of a search for a new head or director. And so I think we see it as our role and we see it as our responsibility to be very much their partner in the process. And from the very earliest stages, of our interaction and partnership with the school, we seek to give them an overview of the process and what the various steps in a successful process will look like, recognizing that they play out a little bit differently often from community to community. But I think it is very much our role and responsibility to be a thought partner and to be a guide and a counselor and of support to a group of people who recognize the importance of getting this decision right. And quite frankly, when that decision occurs successfully, the impact that it has in the life of an organization is so profound. Unfortunately, on the other side of that coin, when it's not a successful search, you can argue that the impact is equally profound, but not in positive ways. And so I think that we enter into it as a partner with boards, being as serious about the search process being as successful as possible as they are. And at the end of the day, not only do we see this partnership as being absolutely critical, but we don't see a search as being successful until the board that we're partnering with tells us that it's been successful. And so it's another aspect, I think, of the commitment that Search Associates does bring to this relationship that, I mean, I've been engaged in processes where they've gone all the way to my anticipating that there may be an appointment only for a board to decide that, you know what, we don't have the right candidate in this mix. And we're kind of back to the drawing board. And when that happens, I just say to boards, you know what, we respect, we honor, we value your perspective. And this isn't a successful search until you have said to us, hey, we have found the right person and we've been successful in making that appointment. So, you know, it's a journey that can last 12, 18, 24 months. We have had scenarios where it's even, they're unusual, but where it's lasted even longer than that. But at the end of the day, it can only be a successful process when the board feels that they have made that right and best fit appointment.
So that's a good segue into what we were wondering about. Once the head of school, they've said, yes, we want candidate XYZ, and that person comes in the following summer. What are some of the steps that can be taken to help with that transition for the new head of school to come in and really connect to the community and have the best chance of success?
Well, and David, that's an excellent question. That's where this lead time ends up being so absolutely critical. The longer the lead time and the more time that a board is able to build into the process, the really forward-looking, forward-thinking boards that are able to launch their search, let's say 2 years in advance of this person beginning so that they can make the appointment, you know, a year in advance, they position themselves to have the opportunity to conduct a smooth and very comprehensively successful transition process. And I, in some ways, reflect on when I was leaving my last post at the American School of Dubai. My successor was actually appointed in April, preceding the beginning of my last year. So we had almost an 18-month period of transition. He was geographically located in the region and so was able to come. He was an hour away by plane and was able to come over the course of that 18 months, maybe came 9 times into the community, participating in a 3-day strategic planning summit that we held when we were able to reflect back on what had been done over the previous years and kind of cast our vision forward. I don't say that that was textbook, you know, in nature, but in many ways it represented the ideal kind of scenario. And so a board that does have a year can really begin to thoughtfully reflect upon, now, how do we get this person interacting with us? With the tools that we have available to us now virtually, they can come into countless meetings that might be appropriate for them to be engaged in. But where are those windows of opportunity that they might be able to come a time or two that will help them get on the campus and begin to build, you know, relationships? I know when I was making a transition to Singapore American School with Bob Gross, you know, I had the opportunity to go and spend a week, you know, in the community. And Bob very thoughtfully introduced me to and connected me with any of a number of the people off the campus that I needed to know and begin to develop a professional relationship with, as well as connected me with people on the campus. And so all of that is a part of that due diligence that a board really wants to do by way of ideally planning the transition. I look back at what it was to come into the international school community in the early 90s, and this would not be much of a stretch of what occurred in too many international schools. A situation where basically the director kind of tidied up his or her office and kind of handed the keys to an administrative assistant and headed off to the airport. And 2 months later, a new person landed and walked into the office and got the keys and began to construct for themselves an understanding of what this transition meant and what it looked like. Fortunately, we have come a long ways, from those days. And now it really is an opportunity where forward-thinking boards want to really create as smooth and as successful of a transition as possible, because so many of our international schools have so much forward momentum. I mean, they have so much work that is underway, and you want that newly arriving director and head of school to be able to step right in and ideally not lose any more momentum than is absolutely necessary. So the importance of that transition is absolutely critical, not only to that person's individual success, but to really build on all the work that's going on in a particular international school community to ensure that it can be further consolidated and sustained.
I'm loving that term, forward momentum. We know how dynamic international schools can be. And if that momentum, it's a wave, it's going forward, you do not want to break that wave. You want to keep it going in whatever new direction or potentially the same direction. So that's pretty powerful.
So for any of our listeners out there who might be a prospective school director, head of school, however the name is in a certain school, do you think it makes a big difference? Have you found in your experience that heads of school or prospective heads of school who have international experience, that it is a different process, if there's any advantages or disadvantages? What's been your experience with that?
That's a great question, Audrey. I mean, my experience specifically has been that boards time and time again gravitate towards appointing people who have had previous international school experience. And, I find this to be an interesting part of the work that I've done at Search over the years. I think I've done now more than 80 searches since joining Search Associates almost 6 years ago. And I've been blessed to be able to do a lot of work with SHEAR and the Office of Overseas Schools, and intend to further that work with Mark Alfers, who's the new executive director in the Office of Overseas Schools. And we've presented on an annual basis at AASA, the American Association of School Administrators, to encourage stateside superintendents to think about the scope and range of professional opportunities that exist within the international school community. But that transition from the U.S. into the international school community, at least for the head of school, is a real challenge. And I think what I would say to you is that, this would be a great, I think, doctoral dissertation topic, but my hypothesis is that boards know the importance of continuity and consistency of leadership. And although they don't articulate it at the beginning of the process, most boards are very clear with us that they want to see as broad and as deep of a candidate pool, and they want to see as many different profiles as they can. But what I'm observing is that time and time again, and I won't say it 80 times, but time and time again, boards gravitate towards appointing people who have international school experience. And if I hypothesize why that is, it's because they place a priority on continuity and consistency of leadership. And I think their concern is that if I appoint someone potentially coming into the international school community for the very first time, it's got to work not only for them, it's got to work for their spouse. It may have to work for their children if they have children. And I think boards know if it doesn't work for any one of those individuals in that equation, they may have a much shorter period of time of having that person engaged in that leadership role than they would have wanted. And so I think they gravitate quite candidly often towards people with international school experience because they demonstrate the ability to have made the transition successfully. And I think boards have greater degrees of confidence that if you've lived, living internationally and visiting internationally are two completely different things. And so often I will talk to candidates who represent to me that, they've traveled very extensively. And they believe because of all of that travel, they really have gotten their head wrapped around, what it will mean to make a transition into the international school world. I think visiting someplace and living someplace are two different things. And so I think it's an interesting phenomena that's occurring. And my guidance and counsel to candidates who are stateside are to think seriously about what are the range of possible opportunities that they might be willing to consider to step into in the international school community. So it may very well be. I came to the international school community personally from a superintendent position in Colorado, but I didn't walk into a head of school role. I stepped into a deputy head of school role. And so I encourage people to think about, would they be willing to entertain a principalship? Would they be willing to entertain a deputy head of school role? Would they be willing to entertain an HR role, a director of learning role? What are the multiple pathways that people might choose to see themselves taking to find themselves coming into the international school community? And then, as I know you both know, it doesn't take long for people who do their work well to begin to really establish their own professional reputation within that community. And then there will be doors that will open up to them over time. And so, it's a great question. And it's a really interesting dynamic that I see play out time and time again.
And I'm going to imagine, too, that a person could perhaps consider, with the same as a teacher who's never had international experience, to apply to a school that was a lower tier school. And we've talked about that with Heather Narrow. So that's another option. But I like that you're not completely ruling out the idea of someone without international experience looking to get into international school headship.
Yeah, we've all entered the international school community at one time or another without any international school experience. And so, I so often get asked by people, if you don't have that experience, how do you get it? And that's where I find that they open the door for me to be able to say to them, well, you know what? Maybe you need to be able to think about multiple pathways into the international school community to get yourself established and to start to really earn a professional reputation for your competence and your abilities to successfully perform. So it's a very interesting dynamic of the work that I've been engaged in. And I find myself quite candidly hearkening back to my counseling skills that go back as a high school counselor to really talk people through some things that they should be thinking about and being willing to entertain a variety, as I've already said, a variety of pathways into the international school.
All right, Brent. So we know you have a job to return to in a few minutes. So we have one more question for you. If you could look into your crystal ball and look out at the future of head of school searches and where it might be going, what are different dynamics that are coming to play, if you could take that on for us.
Well, David, that's a wonderful question. And it's got so many different aspects that are directly connected to it. I think first and foremost, the international school community is a vibrant, constantly changing dynamic. And I think with it are coming demands for more and more leadership. And there are increasingly more schools that are opening all over the world. And with each of those schools that are opening, they're creating greater demand. That necessitates that people really continue to think about within their own career progression, whether leadership positions are professional opportunities that are of interest to them, because there's absolutely no doubt that we continue to need, as much as we need outstanding faculty and outstanding professionals to fulfill virtually every single role in the life of a school, we so too need an increasing number of people who are willing to take on leadership roles. I think the other dynamic is the job itself is changing. It necessitates, I think, first and foremost, that people are very much learning leaders. I think there was a time when, and I'm going to date myself in saying this, but I think there was a time when heads of schools often really carved out a particular skill set that they possessed. And within the international school community, they sometimes moved from community to community to do that work well. Some people had reputations for doing an outstanding job when it came to school finance, and they could put a school back on a very healthy trajectory as it related to the school's financial viability. Other people were excellent when it came to facility development and master planning and the development of a campus. And other people were really good when it came to kind of the focus on the development of the program of learning. And other people were really good around community relations and bringing the community together. I think today an effective and successful head of school has to have all those skills. And I think beyond that, and this is where it's changing, and this is where I know that I'm seeing the world change, you have to be so much more adept, I think, in the use of social media. I think you have to be so much more adept in your ability to pivot. And if I look at COVID, I mean, COVID placed demands on every single group in the life of a community. It placed huge demands on students. It placed huge demands on parents. Faculty were called upon to work harder than I think I've probably in my 50-year career have ever seen the demands on faculty, and leadership likewise. And so the world as we have, whether it's a pandemic or whether we see the nature of the conflict and strife, the displacement, the challenges that are occurring. And then, quite frankly, at the core of the work that we do is teaching and learning and preparing students to inherit a world that have increasing set of global challenges. And so I think the demands on leadership, when you ask, what are the future of leadership searches? I think the future of leadership searches reflect the demands of future leadership itself. And so I think people need to position themselves to understand that a changing world requires a changing mindset and a commitment to that growth mindset. I mean, I think the work that's taking place right now around diversity and equity and inclusion and belonging is so absolutely critical to changes that are occurring. And we've made some progress, but quite frankly, the progress we've made on that front is just so incrementally small. We have to make far more significant strides forward. I was in a particular school where in a focus group, a high school junior said to me, Dr. Mutsch, at what point do you anticipate that our faculty will look more and more like our student body does? And she was talking about the diversity represented within the student body. And I said to her, I would hope that you could become part of the solution to that very problem. We need a more diverse, group of people choosing the profession of education and joining in the work that is so absolutely critical to the needs of our globe, of our world. Because we all know that education is the profession that makes all other professions possible. And we need to get young people enthusiastic and excited about doing the work that we've been fortunate to be able to do over the course of our careers. And so it's an exciting time to be alive. It's an exciting time to be in this world. And this world is changing so unbelievably dramatically and will continue, I think, to change so unbelievably dramatically, that leaders have to position themselves to be able to adapt and cope and lead those changes effectively
Brent,
and successfully.
Thank you so much for all your insights. It's always great to listen to you. You're a very clear, candid kind of speaker. I appreciate it. Very incisive. We know that if anybody wanted to learn more about search, we've got your website listed in our resources. It's also going to be in the show notes. Anything else you want to mention before we close out?
No, I would maybe only repeat something I said right at the beginning. For those that might be listening to this and wondering if they've not previously been a part of the international school community, whether it might be the right opportunity for them, I continue to believe that for those of us who've been blessed to be international educators that we know that it's one of the best kept secrets in the world. And why there aren't more people clamoring to have the opportunities that each of us have had, sometimes escapes me. But it is just such an unbelievably rich life experience. And now that we're back home and I reflect back on almost a quarter of a century of being abroad, I'm so thankful that the door opened up for us and that we were able to walk through it. And there are a lot of people who have the aspiration, but they don't ever successfully execute on taking that step and walking through the door. So I think I would encourage people once again to think seriously about casting, your professional direction towards the international school community, because it's such an unbelievably wonderful set of life experiences. The people you're going to work with, the things you're going to see, it changes your view of yourself. It changes the view of the world that you know, and it changes how you actually have the capacity to interact with that world. And I think both my wife and I talk every single day about how blessed we feel we were to be able to have had that journey with so many absolutely wonderful, wonderful, wonderful
Definitely.
people. So thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. And thank you for painting the picture of this process, because there are folks that the word comes out through the grapevine that the head of school is going to leave and they start wondering what's going to happen. Well, they can listen to this episode and understand how the process works. So thanks again, Brent. We know you've got to get back to the real work that you're doing there and helping schools with this whole process and providing that leadership. And as you said, helping them find the right person and have that right fit, but going in both directions. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
and David,
inviting you to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.